.NET Core web application, it's time to add a controller. To do this, let's start by going into the controller section in the Explore tab. To create a new controller, simply right-click and say New File. We'll call this controller the Hello World controller. And all controller files should end with a .cs, so we'll append that to the very end of hello world.controller. And this file is currently blank. We're going to go ahead and paste in some code here. All of the code that I show you today is available for free to copy and paste from Microsoft's tutorial. You can find a link to that in the description below. For now though, let's just take a look at what this code means. We start with a few using commands. This just simply makes sure that all of the proper components that we need within our controller are initialized. We include our namespace so that we know exactly where inside of the project this controller exists. And then we begin with our class. You'll see here that there are two methods within the controller class. The first one is the index method, and the second is the welcome method. Upon the loading of the index method, you will be able to see the words, "This is my default action." And then when the welcome method specifically is specified, you can see this is the welcome action method. So let's go ahead and try out these new controller methods. To do that, simply go ahead and run your new MVC controller, and you should see it pull up in a different screen. Now, in order to test the functionality of this, let's go ahead and type in /hello world. And you can see that the default action showed up because we're at the index page. There's nothing passed into this URL for the controller other than just hello world. And indeed, if we go back, we see that this was the hello world controller, and upon getting hello world as a part of the URL, we pass in the default action. Now, in order to test whether or not the special welcome action is working, all we need to do is further append welcome onto hello world. And so we can do that. And we see that the welcome action method shows up here. Note that this only occurs when we append welcome to the URL. If we keep the URL at just hello world, we only get the default action. Now that you've got that working, we can go ahead and add some more functionality to this controller. Let's go ahead and change the welcome method a little. Let's start by adding a few different parameters. We can add in a string that holds a name, and maybe an integer that holds a number of times. We'll go ahead and initialize this to 1 to start off with. And then instead of returning just a static string, we can instead return something that's a little bit more complex. Let's return an HTML encoder that is default, and within that, we'll encode some information. We'll start by just saying hello, and then we can pass in the parameter name that we just got through this welcome parameter. And then we can go ahead and pass in the number of times, which we also got in through the parameter, simply using curly brackets to indicate that something is a variable parameter rather than just text. And once this is ready, we can go ahead and move back to our application. And if we go back to that welcome URL, may need to refresh MVC. And once it opens, we should be able to go back to hello world and welcome. And now we see that hello and then no name and then number of times is 1. Now the reason there's no name here is because we haven't passed a name in as a parameter. If you'll recall, we need to take a name into this method. We don't need to take in a number of times because that's already initialized to a default value of 1. So let's go ahead and add in those parameters. To do that, all we need to do is add a question mark as a delimiter to tell MVC that we're passing in some variables, and we can pass in a name. We can pass in maybe my name, Sudan, and a number of times equals, let's say 3. And now you'll see that the text has changed. It now says hello Sudan, and the number of times is 3. So this is a pretty quick way of adding in parameter support and being able to have dynamic text being returned by MVC. Now let's go ahead and change this even further just to make sure that we understand that everything is working. Let's maybe keep string name, but change the integer from num times to ID. And instead of num times, we'll go ahead and add in an ID parameter here. And you'll see that Visual Studio is angry at me right now because I'm trying to call num times, which I just changed up in the parameter, so it no longer exists. So in order to fix this, all we do is type in ID, and then we can go ahead and refresh MVC. And just as before, we can pass in a name parameter. This time I'll pass in the name Rick, and we'll also pass in an ID equals 799. And the reason that didn't work was because I didn't append everything to the URL as I should have. So we need to start with hello world/welcome. And there we go. We have on screen hello Rick, your ID is 799. And you can immediately see how this would be beneficial for things like employment management or dashboards for employees, where it shows them their name, their ID dynamically. That's going to be it for adding a controller. Next time we'll be talking about adding views to MVC.NET 2022.